This is a review of The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies Chronicles, The Art of War. To be honest, I think I've run out of ways to praise this Hobbit Chronicles series, although I'm definitely happy to try because it is completely deserving of it. However, I'll just start with my obligatory nitpick, and that is the title. The way they've titled each of the books in this series has been very inelegant and ambiguous, and that's even without taking into consideration the regional differences, like the US editions have numbers in the title, but this one is actually the worst by far. So the subtitle for this book is The Art of War. Now that may lead some people to think that this is an art book, which it really isn't. It is much more of a making of book. Now there is a little bit of art in this one, which is actually in contrast to the other two making of books in the series, which don't feature any art, but the art book for the Battle of the Five Armies is actually the one previous to this, subtitled Art and Design. So for the Battle of the Five Armies, they've released two grey books, one called The Battle of the Five Armies, Art and Design, and another called The Battle of the Five Armies, The Art of War, only one of which is an actual proper art book. So I don't know what they were thinking, but is this confusing? Yes. Do you need to worry about it? No, not if you plan on getting all 6 books in the series, which, I mean, you absolutely should. But if for some reason you're being more particular about which ones from this series you want to get, I just thought I'd mention that, just so it's sort of clear that despite the fact it has the word art in the title, it's not really an art book. But as for the contents, it really is a continuation of what we've come to expect from the making of books in this series. It really is focused on production design, set dressing, costuming, armor, weapons, things of that nature. And it's really not covering any of the other areas of filmmaking, so you're not going to read things about like sound design or editing or things like that. Although part of me wishes this series had been able to continue for another 6 or 12 books, just so they could cover those other areas, screenwriting, directing, editing, stunts, visual effects, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it does touch on some of that stuff in this book, but mostly only as it relates to the sort of design ideas of the movie. But ultimately, I am so glad that this series has decided to be so focused, because what almost all other making of books do is try to capture every aspect of making the movie in one book, and it doesn't work because it's just spread too thin. You can't possibly cram enough detail for all those different areas into one book. So to have this series of books that is sort of 3 or 6 books, depending on how you want to look at it, that just focus on the art and design of sort of the things that physically appear on screen is just amazing. In fact, there was a stage in this book when I was reading about the costumes that the dwarves wear in the Battle of the Five Armies, and I almost didn't want to read it just because I was so sick of reading about these dwarves and their bloody costumes, because they've had their initial costumes, and then in Lake Town they got new costumes, and then they had their regal armor and then their battle armor, and you have to remember that for each of those they give 2 pages to each of the 13 dwarves. So that's just so much about reading about these dwarves' costumes, and I was just so sick of it. And though it may not sound like it, that is actually the highest compliment I can give this series. Because the criticism, or at least point of disappointment that I feel with pretty much every other making of book, is that it's never enough. There's never enough detail or depth. I wanted more. I've said that sort of stuff time and time again in reviews for other making of books. Whereas with this series, these books have left me feeling satisfied, and then some. And it's just such a great sensation, because I really haven't encountered that with many other making of books before. The other thing that I think is really great, that I don't really think I've touched on in these reviews, is the actual sort of graphic design and layout of these books. It's almost got this sense of sort of like a chaotic archive, but it is handled real well and with a sense of organization. So it means that pretty much every page is just sort of overwhelming in a really good way. Like, with the exception of a few stills from the movies that are printed a little too large, there is not a single inch of wasted space in any of these 6 books. Some of the ways they've tried to cram just one more image in is really great, and every time you turn the page there's just so much for your eyes to look at, and the layout and the presentation of these pages is really incredible and among some of the best I've ever seen. Likewise, not only the number of images they get in this book, but actually the quality of the images is really staggering. There's sort of a lot of the really great archival detailed photography of like the props and the weapons, the costumes. You really get to study these great items in a detail you don't get to appreciate on the screen. For example, despite the fact that I've watched the movies a couple of times and watched all the behind-the-scenes appendices, I never knew that the Mirkwood elven officers actually have silver armor instead of the more bronzy gold that the rank-and-file troops have. But I found that in this book. And again, just like all the other books in this series, the text is all commentary from the folks who made this stuff. Sometimes that might just be a small paragraph of 2 or 3 sentences. Sometimes it's like an entire page just by one person explaining how something was made. Although with these books, I don't necessarily, I think I mentioned this in another review, but it's not necessarily the focus of this text isn't really like how we did what we did. It's more like why we did what we did, meaning that most of it is sort of more explaining the rationale behind the designs, how it services the characters, the story, the world. Although with some of the comments there definitely is a sense of like sort of more explaining exactly how something was made, or the design process and evolution, why it worked, why it didn't. Although then sometimes you do get really boring comments from typically Philippa Bynes, the writer, or any of the actors, where they're just recapping the story or explaining what happened in a scene, or like how characters are feeling, their relationship towards one another. And it's like, I've seen the movie, I know all that stuff. But thankfully that's very much the minority. And actually I think that's a great way to sort of understand my overall impression of these books, because I have been giving them a lot of what I feel is deserved praise, but at the same time I don't sort of want to oversell it, and I hope you'll come to these with realistic expectations, because, you know, is every photograph amazing? Is every comment or even page perfect? No. We could sit down and look through every page and pick apart all the useless things and problems, but my point is, while these books may not be perfect, they come much closer to perfection than pretty much any other art and making of books I've ever read. So I actually feel sorry for the next art or making of book that I read next, because to me these Hobbit Chronicle books have really raised the bar for me. Actually, the next book is going to be related to this Hobbit Chronicle series, because even though I've done reviews of all 6 main books, there is actually a Hobbit Chronicles companion that is just about Smaug, so we'll take a look at that in a couple of weeks and see how it compares to the main series.